Level up your LA Kings experience with the new Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access. Enjoy great seats to the game along with premier dining inside the Lexus Club with all-you-can-eat food and non-alcoholic beverages. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings item and parking with your purchase. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn rewards on each purchase from the only ticket company that rewards you for buying. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings.
You're listening to an LA Kings podcast. For more episodes of this and every other Kings program, visit lakings.com/podcast.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
All right, joining me today, Josh Schafer. How are you doing today, Josh?
I'm doing great, Jesse. Thanks for having me.
And the reason that you were joining me today is twofold. Take this in the spirit with which it's intended, but Zach Dooley finds himself in Quebec. So
thanks.
Yeah. But more importantly than that, I believe other than Daryl Evans, you are the only non-player / coach / trainer, whatever. Like, you're not on the team. Other than Daryl Evans, I believe you're the only person to actually have watched all 4 preseason games live and in person to this point.
Yeah, I think actually the 3 total are me, Daryl, and Jim Hiller.
Right.
Maybe a few others.
Yeah.
Definitely more. But
I think maybe I don't know if, I don't know. Do they travel like Kinger and Bryson and Grange and everybody?
Yeah.
Okay, so those guys might have. I don't know. Anyway, the point is you've been there in a way that nobody else has. Before we launch into your thoughts on the 4 games that you've watched, I do want to cover the top 10 questions that we asked at the start of training camp, because by asking those questions, it's going to bring us up to date on all the roster moves, because there have been many. Not all of them reported, because at some point it's the preseason, the team's going to Quebec, there's little tiny moves. Anyway, so we're going to leap right into it, Josh. Question number 1 is which goalies will be assigned to which teams? And the reason that this is a perfect example of what we're talking about is Phoenix Copley is still on the LA Kings training camp roster because he has traveled to Quebec with the team, just like they carried 3 goalies to Australia last year. They carried 3 goalies with them to Quebec. I don't know this for a fact, Josh, but I'm assuming this is to simply provide an extra body in the unfortunate event that something happens to one of their 2 goalies. They don't have to wait for a flight for Phoenix Copley. He's there already.
Yeah, exactly.
And he may play one of the games, but that's really why he's there.
No, yeah, I think exactly. I think for me, coming into camp, coming out of camp, the 2 guys that you would expect to be with the Kings are Darcy Kuemper and David Rittich. And when it comes to at least the Ontario Reign, Eric Portillo is the really easy one. And he's been terrific last year and throughout the preseason. And then Phoenix Copley, because obviously with the really bad injury that he had last year and David Rittich getting his opportunity with the Kings, it was kind of just the same thing that happened with Phoenix Copley and his NHL opportunity over a year ago now. Same thing with David Rittich this past year, except there was an injury involved, obviously. And unfortunately for Copley, for me, I would have thought that he would end up maybe not cracking the Kings opening night roster, but getting back up to speed with the Ontario Reign again seems reasonable, at least in my opinion. But yeah, so he is with the Kings in Quebec, and I think that makes a whole heck of a lot of sense, especially when you consider that the Kings for these final 2 games of the preseason are then going straight into their long East Coast road trip. Mm-hmm. So it would make sense to have what you would expect to be your NHL opening night roster on the road for this trip, which is typically where you're at this point in the preseason anyway, to have an NHL caliber goalie who could immediately step in if and when he's needed.
Now, ordinarily, the conversation would end with that, and we would say Dryden McKay is in Reign camp, but there's an addition to Ontario Reign training camp, and that is Jacob Ingham. So the King, he's on an AHL PTO, I'm assuming, for training camp, although I don't know that for a fact. But he has not signed an NHL ELC, so he and Dryden McKay are available to the Reign or the Swamp Rabbits, but that was the question, which goalies were going where. So now the Kings have 6 goalies split between their 2 camps, 3 on the NHL training camp, 3 in the AHL training camp. Kuemper, Rittich, Copley, Portillo, McKay, and Ingham. That's probably the split. Moving on, the second question was, what will the forward lines be to start the season? And we have a similar situation here that we do to the goaltenders, because the Kings currently have 15, actually they have more than 15 forwards in camp. because Taylor Ward is injured and has not yet been assigned to Ontario, same as Arthur Kaliev. You can't assign players when they're injured, at least is my understanding. So the forward lines in Quebec with the Kings are Laferriere, Kopitar, and Kempe, Moore, Deneau, and Jeannot, Fiala, Byfield, and Fogle, Turcotte, Thomas, and Lewis, with 3 extra forwards. And this is my impression of who are the top 12 and who are the bottom 3, but an additional trio of Lee, Studnicka, and Fagemo. I suppose, Josh, that there's an open battle for spots on the 4th line, or to be the 13th forward or possibly the 14th forward. But the Kings will not start the season with all 3 of those that 5th line that I just read.
Yeah, they won't. And for what it's worth, the lines that you just gave not only are the lines that we have seen in preseason games, but they are the exact lines that we saw almost every single day at training camp, maybe, just maybe, with a different player flip-flopping here and there. But we saw these lines at training camp multiple times throughout camp before the first preseason game. And even when, for example, Laferriere, Kopitar, and Kempe are playing together in a preseason game and Fiala, Byfield, and Fogle are not, one of those lines is together, and then when those next 3 guys come back into the lineup, they are once again together again. So we have seen a little bit of flip-flopping where, Akil Thomas played with Kopitar and Kempe when Laferriere did not play versus, Akil Thomas with Deneau and Jeannot in for Trevor Moore. But we also saw a game where Laferriere was slated to play, Kopitar and Kempe were not, so he played with Alex Turcotte, and those 2 had a great link-up. So, the forward lines that you gave in their specific lines and in that order are what we saw throughout camp, so no surprises there.
And to be clear, it's what Rob Blake told Zach Dooley in July or whenever it was that they spoke.
Yeah, exactly. And for me, I've really liked what we've seen from those 4 forward lines. Especially, there's been guys who have performed well in some preseason games versus not so well in some others, but those 4 lines specifically, I thought have worked so far based off of the 4 exhibition games and the few inter-squad scrimmages that we've seen. I've liked what we've seen so far, so no reason for me to expect anything otherwise. And then those 3 other guys, Samuel Fagemo, he's somebody who dominated the American League last year, 43 goals, Ontario Reign AHL record for single season goals. He is somebody that I thought coming in would factor in to the NHL lineup for the Kings. Maybe in this current format with what we've seen from the 12 guys that are currently in is maybe one of the guys left out for now. Jack Studnicka has NHL experience in the Pacific Division with multiple teams, over 100 games of NHL action for him. He's somebody that I thought early on would probably end up with Ontario, similar to Andre Lee, who I think will probably be with the Reign to start the season, but has had a terrific camp, has played very, very well in preseason games, and completely unprompted, Jim Hiller has brought him up in press conferences now multiple times. So he is definitely somebody that I think Jim Hiller and his staff like at this point. So, there's obviously an injury to Arthur Kaliev, as I'm sure we'll touch on later on. I think that, it's an unfortunate situation for him right after signing the contract, but it does potentially open up an opportunity for somebody else right now on the NHL squad. And those 3 guys were probably the 3 that I expected after the Kaliev injury, and they're the 3 that are still with the team in Quebec.
So we're going to combine 4 of the questions into one broader conversation right now. The questions are 3 through 5 and number 7.
So a bunch of questions are all one question.
And you'll see why they have to be combined together in a second. The questions are: who will play on the power play? What will the defensive pairs be to start the season? Who will play on the penalty kill? And how many defensemen will be on the roster for game 1?
I see why they're all one question now.
So before
they weren't one question 5 days ago.
Right.
And now they are.
Correct. And of course, we're talking about the injury to Drew Doughty, and that obviously changes so many things that the Kings do. Before Drew Doughty was injured, I am prepared to say with 99.9% certainty that the Kings were planning on carrying 8 defensemen, and those defensemen would have been Anderson, Doughty, Gavrikov, Spence, Edmondson, Clark, Englund, and Burrows. And I'm I tried to be as coy about it as possible in previous episodes where I said Zach and I are both anticipating, and what I meant by that was Zach and I both work here, and we know that that's what it's going to be. And so anybody else who's hemming and hawing over whether it's going to be 7 defensemen and 14 forwards and who are the 14 forwards, that was my way of trying to delicately say, listen, I can't tell you how I know, but we know that that's what it's going to be. But then Drew Doughty got hurt, and now I don't know anymore.
Yeah.
So all those conversations that I was poo-pooing, it turns out, were probably fairly valid. Because at this point, Josh, I shouldn't say we know. It looks very much like Brandt Clarke will take Drew Doughty's power play time, but not his even strength time.
Right.
It looks like they want to keep him with Edmondson. And this is based on like 2 or 3 practices and 1 preseason game. This is not the stated intent of, Jim Hiller hasn't sat down and told us this is what they want to do. Rob Blake hasn't sat down and told us what they want to do. But watching the practices, watching how it's been working out, it seems like Brandt Clarke makes the most sense on power play 1. And Jordan Spence may or may not wind up playing with Mikey Anderson, but it seems to me like they want to keep Brandt Clarke with Joel Edmondson.
Yeah, that much to me seems pretty clear. And I think that that's a good move. I thought they've played well together. Clarke is a defenseman who likes to be, I like to say, a little bit more exploratory with the puck. He'll join the rush. He obviously on the power play is very active. He will skate in deep if he needs to. He likes to have the puck on his stick. He's a distributor. Joel Edmondson, he is a much more stay-at-home defenseman. He's calm, cool, and collected. There's a reason he's played so many games in this league. There's a reason why he's a Stanley Cup champion. And I think that those two will fit well together, and it seems like they've enjoyed playing together throughout training camp and throughout the preseason games because I think Edmondson calms down that pairing a little bit and also allows Clarke to be a little bit more creative and explore the ice a little bit more. So I think that's the one that I think will definitely stick together after the Doughty injury. I think you're absolutely correct. Brandt Clarke seems to be the new kind of point man on the power play, at least power play 1. I would expect Jordan Spence to be the guy on power play 2, as you mentioned. Look, kind of like you just said, Gavrikov-Spence was a pairing last year, and Anderson-Doughty was a pairing the last couple years, as we expected.
England and Spence was actually...
Sorry, England and Spence. Yeah. Gavrikov and Spence have played together before, and they did a little bit last year, but England and Spence was more of a pairing. England played in all 82 last year. I thought... if you would have asked me this question 5-6 days ago, I think I would have given you a different answer. I think my very quick answer would have been Mikey Anderson will play with Kyle Burroughs.
Yeah.
Because of Burroughs has played a lot in the preseason. He's played very well. He was, I can't remember the exact number here, but I did actually write this number down on some notes recently. Kyle Burroughs was, I believe, top 5 in the league in hits last year. So he can be physical. He covers a lot of ground. He's a reliable right-handed defenseman. Obviously, the Kings made the trade in the offseason. That now I thought it was a good trade at the time. It looks really good now, but there's no way to prepare for losing, a future Hall of Famer to injury on his first shift of the preseason. But Kyle Burroughs has looked really, really good this preseason. And as soon as Drew Doughty went down in that preseason game 1 or 2 shifts in, for the rest of the night, Kyle Burroughs played with Mikey Anderson and looked really good. The next day at training camp, they were on a pair together again. But fast forward a few more preseason games, Mikey Anderson's playing with Jordan Spence now. So I really don't know what to expect from or for who ends up being Mikey Anderson's partner on the right side. I'm not sure you can go wrong because I've really liked the way Jordan Spence has played the last few games. I wrote something in my notes the other night in Anaheim that early in the game, he was quick to shoot the puck. He was playing the way that Drew Doughty typically plays on the right side while paired with Mikey Anderson. But at the same time, I think Jim Hiller and this staff have seen a lot of stuff from Kyle Burroughs where they should feel confident with whoever they pair him with right now. I'll tell you, if you were to look at Daily Faceoff, type in LA Kings lines right now, it's got Gavrikov and Spence and Anderson and Burroughs. But I'm not sure that's what it's going to end up being come opening night.
Burrows was top 4 among defensemen.
Among defensemen
in
in hits.
hits, yeah. 233. Brandon Dillon, 241. Simon Benoit, 246. Jeremy Lauzon, 383. So a lot. Ahead of Radko Gudas.
Yeah. That guy hits a lot of people.
Yeah. The other wrinkle in all this is, will the Kings choose to keep 8 defensemen on the roster when the season starts? They have 8 in Quebec right now. The 8th being Caleb Jones, who has 242 NHL games under his belt and can play both sides. Or will they assign somebody back to Ontario once the regular season starts? They have 8 with them in Quebec, just as the same as with the goalies and with the forwards. You do want to have extra bodies. Now, 8 defensemen is one more than most teams carry, so that's already built in that you have extra. But yeah, the Burrows question, will Burrows be the 6th defenseman? If not, will it be Caleb Jones playing on his off wing? Will it be Andreas Englund playing on his off? I really doubt it'll be Andreas Englund playing on his off wing, but they have those options available to them.
Yeah, I think I obviously, and people are going to talk about this a lot. I know that you and I have talked about this a lot recently. I'm sure you guys have brought it up on the podcast recently. There was a time not very long ago where the Kings had a surplus of right-handed defensemen and needed some lefties. Now the Kings have 3 healthy right-handed shooting defensemen available to them: Burrows, Clark, and Jordan Spence. So it's thin. So, on this topic, what stands out to me is a question that I asked Jim Hiller the other day after training camp, and that was, last year you guys had to play a lot with a lefty playing on their offhand or vice versa, whatever. You guys had to play with a defenseman playing on their off wing last year. I'm not sure if they would like to do that again. To me, it seems like no. Talking with Zach Dooley, it seems like that's not what they want to do this year. So I asked Jim Hiller, is this, I know that you guys would prefer to have a righty fill in for Drew Doughty. Are you committed to that idea, or would you experiment with a lefty? And he said, obviously, a right-hander is preferred. Now, Jacob Moverari was placed on waivers at the time of recording for the purpose of being sent down to Ontario. By the time this comes out, there's a chance that he's already with the Ontario Reign.
He cleared.
He did clear? Yeah, okay, so he would have cleared right before we started recording this. So Jacob Moverari clears. He's a lefty, but again, is so calm, cool, and collected even for one of the younger guys that he has frequently played as a lefty on the right side before. He played on the right side the other night in Anaheim, and Jim Hiller said, we were just experimenting. We just wanted to see how it would go. So with that being said, if the Kings did hold 2 more defensemen for a total of 8 on the opening night roster, that would include 2 additional lefty defensemen, like you said, Englund, who I would be surprised to see him play on the right, and Caleb Jones, who can play on the right, like you said, but I would expect the Kings to be more comfortable with him on the left as well. So it'll certainly be interesting if they decide to keep 2 additional left-handed defensemen on the roster just because they don't know when Drew Doughty's coming back and because he's listed month to month. I wouldn't be shocked, but it is certainly something to keep in mind that if they do that, they're going to have 5 lefty defensemen on the roster.
Based on Jim Hiller's response to your question and other things that I have heard, I am of the opinion that the organization is reluctant to have multiple right-hand shots paired as a pair together. Like, they don't want to do righty-righty.
I agree.
But lefty-lefty it's done way more often because there's just way more left-handed defensemen than there are right-shot defensemen. So I want to add this wrinkle in right now because it's not in the top 10 questions, but it seems like this is a perfectly fine place to do it. Cole Krieger, who is yet another left-handed defenseman, and Taylor Ward, who is a right shot forward, both of them are still on the Kings training camp roster because both of them are, I don't know if injured is the correct word, but hurt. And so they will remain on the Kings roster until they are healthy enough to join Reign camp. That's just a function of league rules. Last year, I think it was Andre Lee was on season opening injured reserve. Any player with a 2-way contract that is injured during training camp remains technically on the main club, but is on what's called season opening injured reserve. Their cap hit doesn't count, etc. However, Arthur Kaliev and Drew Doughty could theoretically be placed on long-term injured reserve right away.
Yes.
If they are not, it's possible that the Kings would carry 22 players, not 23, and be closer to the cap and accrue more space later on down the road because of the complications of how cap space is accrued. It's a daily equation, LTIR. I don't fully understand all of it, but I ran this by somebody earlier today, and I think I have this right. While I fully expected that on day one of the season, Kaliev and Doughty would simply be placed on long-term injured reserve because they're both going to miss the requisite, whatever it is, 10 days or 10 games, 24 days, whatever the limit is. But it's possible that Kaliev will simply be kept on injured reserve in order to do cap shenanigans. If that were the case, the Kings would have only room for 2 extra skaters, not 3. And so maybe that would change what they do with 8 defensemen or 7 defensemen. I don't know. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. For today, those are the conversations about defensemen and where we're at. So
I've been with this organization now. This is my 4th full season. I'm still not sure I understand the cap math and how certain things are done. And I know that you've been here longer, and I know for a fact you don't understand either. And neither does Zach Dooley. I know he's not here to defend himself, but he doesn't get it either.
I thought I did, and this morning I went in very cocky and said, asked this question to someone. They said, okay, listen, I get it. When you put someone on long-term injured reserve, you want to be as close to the cap as you possibly can because the cap overage that you get is the amount of the contract that's being placed on LTR minus the gap between where you were and the cap. Blah, blah. And the guy just looked at me and went, no. Oh, gosh. I was so confident I understood. And no, that's not necessary. It's blah, blah. So
when I first started doing games here during COVID, I didn't really work for the organization yet, and that was when the taxi squad was a thing, and there was a move every single day, and I was doing just a handful of games for the Reign at the time, just kind of one after the other, just on a game by game basis, and I would talk with Zach Dooley on the phone. I'd be like, so this guy did, and Zach was like, look, I don't know.
Yeah.
Just do the game.
I desperately want to understand LTIR because it is can be such a contentious issue, and it does impact how you operate your cap, but I don't.
Call somebody in Tampa Bay. They've figured it out. Or Vegas. Vegas knows very well.
Most teams have a guy, and unfortunately, the guy that we used to have who would patiently sit down and explain it to me no longer works for the club, and so I've got to build my new
get a new guy.
Yeah, I mean I've got one, but I'm a dummy apparently, so I don't understand how it works. Anyway, moving on. The next one is who will be the last cuts/surprise standouts, and the answer here we kind of touched on it earlier, but Studnicka and Lee I think count as the late cuts because they're in Quebec, and those are the 2 guys that I would frankly be surprised if either one of them is on the opening roster game 1, unless further injuries occur. Lee is not terribly surprising because, as you said, Jim Hiller has gone out of his way to talk about him. He and Hellenius in particular, both of them getting a lot of attention and a lot of praise. Jack Studnicka came out of nowhere and took me completely by surprise. When they signed Malott, Godin, and Studnicka, my brain chunked them together as a trio. And in my mind, they were like basically the same guy. They were going the same place, filling the same role, doing the same thing. Jack Studnicka, he's up there. He's on the roster. He's got a chance until he doesn't.
Yeah, he's a good player. I remember last year in the American League, he was a player that was originally drafted in the 2nd round by the Bruins. He was there for a handful of years, went to Vancouver. Back in the 22-23 season, he played 47 games for the Canucks and 1 game for the Bruins. Did not play any AHL games that season. And then last year, started in Vancouver, played a few games in the AHL, traded to San Jose, played 17 games for San Jose, and then back down to the AHL where he played for the Barracuda. And basically, I felt like last year was too up and down of a season. He played for 4 different teams at 2 different levels and 2 organizations where maybe he just couldn't maintain his consistency. But for me, when he was traded to San Jose late in the season and the Reign played them all the time late in the season, he stood out to me as San Jose's best player. So when he came over here in the offseason, that was a guy that I thought immediately like, oh, not only will he have a chance with the Kings because he's 25 years old. He turns 26 in February, but 25-year-old guy. He's played 100 games of NHL experience, 107 games of NHL experience. This is a guy that, for me, will immediately slot in and be one of Ontario's top guys in the AHL, or be a pretty reliable plug-and-play guy in the NHL and could compete out of camp. Now, for me, I wasn't totally shocked by the way that he came in with the Kings this year, but he's still around. I'm not surprised that he is going to be potentially one of these final cuts or, get an opportunity. But yeah, he is somebody that I would say to certainly keep an eye out for this year, especially if he does end up getting sent to the Ontario Reign before Kings opening night.
I want to talk about the difference between Lee, Studnicka, and Fagemo, because it's three guys arguably fighting for at most 2 spots. And each of them has a totally different role in Ontario.
Completely different.
If they are not one of the ones that sticks around. So Lee plays a bottom 6 role in Ontario, would play a bottom 6 role in LA. Studnicka would play a bottom 6 role in LA, but in Ontario would be like one of the top 2 centers.
He'd be a top 6 guy for sure.
And Fagemo, I was fully expecting him to be a healthy scratch on most nights, maybe rotate in the lineup with somebody else for the Kings. But in Ontario, he's a 40 goal scorer.
He's arguably the best scorer in the league.
Yeah. So the question I have, and the question the Kings have to ask themselves is, even if one player outshines the other, is it more valuable to you to have a potential 40 goal scorer not playing, a 40 goal scorer in the AHL, not playing at all? Or is it more valuable for you to have a guy like Andre Lee, who would be a third line player on the Reign? If Hellenius and Ward can find a suitable third partner for that line in Ontario, you're not theoretically missing as much from Andre Lee being out of the Reign lineup as you would be for Samuel Fagemo. So you have to do this sort of weird value balance of like, who are you losing out on by not playing them more? And I don't know the answer to that question.
I don't necessarily know the answer to that question either. It's an interesting way to look at it. For me, Andre Lee is a player who, when he was playing in the NCAA at UMass Lowell, was more of a skill guy. He's huge, right? Like, he's a huge dude. And in college, like a lot of guys are, in college or juniors, they're going to score a lot of points, rack up a lot of goals. He came in with the Reign and adjusted to a bottom 6 role, at least in my opinion, very quickly, and settled in very nicely. The thing with Andre Lee, though, is he's good at that role. He's a good player. But he also still has some of those tendencies where he's told us before, like, I can be a skill guy. If you give the guy the puck and some daylight, he's probably going to score. Like, he's not just going to throw the puck on net and it's going to deflect in. Like, Andre Lee's a skilled player. He can shoot the puck and he can create some chances, and he's learned how to use his body and his size and his weight to create space for himself in that way. So he's a player that you'll see those sides of him shine in the AHL. I don't know if that translates to the NHL right now because I don't know what role he would be playing. So I think that he would fit pretty well because he would play a bottom 6 role and he should do fine. But are those skillful offensive, attributes going to show if he were in the NHL every night or in and out of the NHL lineup? I'm not sure. I know they will in Ontario. Studnicka has been a pretty reliable guy wherever he has been plugged in the AHL or in the NHL. Last year, he played in 17 games with the Sharks, didn't record any points. I'm not going to hold that against him because San Jose was not very good. So that's kind of, you can't be too critical there. But he's somebody that I think the Kings would get a reliable forward play out of him. Samuel Fagemo's different because this dude, in my opinion, my humble opinion, after seeing him score 41 or 43 goals last year, should have been the league MVP, or at least should have been in the conversation, and was for some reason, unbeknownst to me, was not even a first-team All-Star. Can't explain it. But he set the Ontario Reign single-season goal-scoring record. He's probably, if he were to be with the Reign this season, he would easily be the most prolific scorer in the league this year.
Wasn't he second in goals last year in the AHL?
And played fewer games, yeah.
Played like 20 fewer games.
Yes, so that's why I think he should have been in the MVP conversation. But that's neither here nor there. With Ontario, he's going to be that again. You should expect him to be a 40-goal scorer if he's with the Reign. With the Kings, I'm just not sure, because when he has had opportunities with the Kings, he hasn't been put in positions where he can score goals. You know, one thing that I've said in the past is that I know that Martin Frk is different because this is an Ovechkin level shot that this guy had, but he was an AHL player. When he was called up to fill a role on the Kings, he was immediately power play 1, get the puck to Martin Frk, and he will score. Like, that's what happened every time he got called up. He scored in big moments. Remember the Florida game a couple years ago? That was unreal. Martin Frk would be given those opportunities. When Arthur Kaliyev first came up, he was immediately on the left circle on power play 2. His first year with the Reign, that guy had an NHL caliber shot, Arthur Kaliyev. With Samuel Fagemo, we just haven't seen that yet. He hasn't been given those power play opportunities really when he has played in the NHL. A lot of times he's played a fourth line role, which is just not the role that he should be playing as a forward. But look, that's the difference between the way that he's playing in the AHL and in the NHL. It's not a coaching thing. It's not a game plan thing. It's usually on the player. But for me, it's tough to say with Samuel Fagemo just because he hasn't had as many NHL opportunities up to this point. We know what he's capable of in the AHL, but in the NHL, he's going to have to play a different style of game, which he doesn't play in the AHL.
In the AHL, 43 goals. We're going to test your AHL knowledge here. How many game-winning goals?
How many game-winning goals for Fagemo? Well, I know that it was at least, I think he had 3 in overtime. At least.
He did have 3 in overtime.
3 overtime goals, so at least 3.
Yeah.
I'm going to say...
I'll give you a hint. He led the league.
He led
game winners.
He led the league with, 19 power play goals?
Yes.
I'm 2 for 2.
Yeah.
So 19 power play goals, 3 overtime goals. I want to say he had is it lower than the power play goals?
Yeah.
I'll say 13 game-winning goals.
10.
Oh.
Still leads the league.
I'll take it.
17 fewer games than Gaudette, whoever was number 1 in goal. Yeah, so
yes.
Adam Gaudette, 44 goals, Samuel Fagemo, 43, and 17 fewer games. Here's the real question, though. Who was tied for second with 9?
In game-winning goals?
Yeah.
Western Conference or Eastern Conference?
Ontario Reign.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. Keel Thomas.
Yep, there you go.
Yeah, easy.
Yep.
Easy.
All right, so just had to drill as I was looking it up and found him. So moving on then, the next question is, will the Kings lose any players to waivers? As of today, no. So great. It's only a couple
Thumbs
more
up.
opportunities. Yeah. Will any invitees earn contracts? Not yet. It's not done yet. The real question will be done when Reign camp ends, and we'll find out, because somebody might get an
kinds
AHL
of contracts.
Well,
Yeah,
anything.
AHL.
Like
Yeah.
Jacob Ingham didn't have an AHL contract, September 1st, and now he's in Reign camp. So I guess technically he's an invitee, but no camp invitees wound up with NHL ELCs. And then the final question, how will Arthur Kaliyev factor into the roster? And we probably should have made that one a question about injuries, but as I said, whether or not Arthur Kaliyev was placed on LTIR may determine how many actual roster spots are available. Again, that's cap math that I am not good at, so we're not going to dwell on it. Those are the 10 questions, Josh. I told you before we recorded I wanted to ask those questions, get through all the camp issues, and then I just wanted to talk to you about your impressions of the team through the first 4 games, because very different rosters in all 4 games. We saw Kopitar and Kempe in a game. We've seen Byfield in a couple games. We saw John Parker Jones get in a game, for gosh sakes.
He did.
So anything, I know it's hard to pick a standout when it's not the same roster, it's not the same player, it's not the same lineups and pairs every night, but if you had one takeaway from the first 4 games.
If I had one takeaway from the first 4 games.
Or more than one, it doesn't have to be one.
I think the newcomers have been very good. And I know it's the preseason. I know that it's a small sample size. But I think that Tanner Jeannot, Warren Foegele, Joel Edmondson, and Kyle Burrows, to be specific about those 4.
Can I add a name to the list?
Yeah.
He's not a newcomer, but he's in a new role. I think Alex Laferriere joins that list.
Yes, yeah, I think that one's a little bit different. So I'll address both of those groups.
Right.
First the four, and then Laferriere. I think those four players have been so good. It has been great to see Tanner Jeannot score 2 goals in 2 preseason games with his 2 new line mates. Warren Fogle has also looked terrific. He has a goal in the preseason as well. I think that Kyle Burroughs, as I mentioned earlier, I don't know if I'm surprised by Kyle Burroughs because he was a guy that obviously I would expect to have been with the Kings anyway, regardless of what happened with the Drew Doughty situation. But it has been very nice where, Drew Doughty unfortunately gets hurt, and immediately in that game, it was like, Kyle Burroughs is good. So that has been really nice to see. And I like the way that Joel Edmondson has been a really good counterpart to Brandt Clarke through their few games paired together as well. So I think that's one really big point to me, and I am very much optimistic to see how those 4 play at the start of the season. I wish them well. They have been fun to watch so far. And again, we haven't seen too much line shuffling either. So with the 2 forwards, they have paired very well on their current lines. And they've both said, I'm just paraphrasing here, but they've both commented that it's pretty clear that my 2 line mates have chemistry together. They like to dance around with the puck. And I'm going to contribute too. I'm going to create space. I'm going to see what I can do to contribute. And so far, both of those guys have. On your point for Alex Laferriere, I'm very excited to see what Laf does this year. I think that he fits with Kopitar and Kempe very well. He certainly has the offensive attributes that those 2 players have, where he can contribute skillfully, offensively, etc. But also, he has a little bit of a different skill set where I think he can help create some space for those 2 as well, in the same way that, Kopitar can create space for Kempe and Laferriere. So I'm really excited to see what those guys will bring. Last year, I want to say Laferriere did play a lot on the other wing. This year, he's going back to a place on the left side, presumably, with Kopitar and Kempe, and I think he'll fit really well there. And what's been nice is not only, again, it's the preseason, it's only been a couple games, not only has he played well and looked good with those 2 in the preseason, but then when he was elevated and played with Alex Turcotte for the game in Las Vegas, I thought those 2 looked really good together too. So I've been very impressed with the way that Laferriere has looked throughout camp and in the preseason games and scrimmages, just because it's like, okay, it's year 2 now. Last year he wasn't supposed to make the team. He wasn't in Australia with the group. And I think about this regularly when we talk about Alex Laferriere being with the Kings. Our episode of the Rain Check last year that you, me, and Jared Schafer did, you asked, is there anybody that could make the camp, right? Because the Kings roster is pretty much packed. And I don't want to say it was a resounding no, but it was a pretty confident no. No, nobody from the Rain is going to be the surprise at Kings camp. Unfortunately for the Rain, the Kings roster is pretty much set. And then we said, well, Laferriere's been good. I don't know, maybe nailed it. He was terrific. He made the team out of camp, played one preseason game for the Rain, scored twice, was awesome, and was never seen again in Ontario. So he's been that good, but it was also his first season, and after a really fun start to the year for him, it kind of evened out a little bit throughout the year. He scored in bursts and things like that, a little bit up and down, but overall pretty consistent. Now it's year 2, and he's playing with the top 2 forwards in the organization. So I'm excited to see what he's got. I would expect him to have a pretty good year and definitely improve on where he was a year ago when he wasn't even supposed to make the team, and here he is.
I know I've told this story on the podcast before, but I'll tell it again, and you tell me if I've ever told you before. The story of when Jared Schafer began working for the Rain and asked me about Sean Durzi. Mm-hmm. Started working here, it started working here in the summer. Camp started, he was working with the Rain guys. I guess he really liked Durzi or whatever, and just came to me one day and was trying to get a feel for the whole situation and said, what do you think? Does Sean Durzi have a shot at making the roster? This is summer of 2021. Mm-hmm. And I laughed in his face. I was like, no, no chance. What are you talking about? I don't know. I said at the time, I have no idea how Sean Durzi is, but we'll never know because he's not going to sniff a spot.
Yeah.
And then Sean Walker got hurt, and then Drew Doughty got hurt, and now Sean Dursey makes $6 million a year. And I was just loud wrong. But yeah, that's why that question got in there earlier about late cuts and camp, because there's always, whether it's Arthur Kaliyev getting suspended and Victor Arvidsson, going on LTIR, whether it's Drew Doughty, breaking his ankle or whatever it was that he did, and Kaliyev fracturing a clavicle, like now everything's different.
Yeah.
So
it's hard to predict.
Yeah. Man plans, God laughs, whatever the expression is. I do want to talk about Tanner Jeannot a little bit, though. I did a post-game Twitter space with John Hoven, the mayor, after the Ducks game in Anaheim. And he asked me who stood out to me. And the player that most stood out to me in that game, which I thought otherwise was fairly boring, was Tanner Jeannot. Because Tanner Jeannot scored a goal and got an assist off of plays that were the kind of plays that you specifically go to get Tanner Jeannot to execute. Mm-hmm. And Tanner Jeannot, through no fault of his own, was traded for a boatload of picks. We've talked about this already. He's traded for a first, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, and a player who was taken in the first.
A lot.
A ton. And then the Kings traded a second and a fourth for him.
Great deal.
Like when you add up all the pieces that have been moved to acquire Tanner Jeannot, it's like it's a full draft class. Yeah. So he comes with expectation, and I don't know that it's his fault. I don't need him to be Ziggy Palffy. I need him to be Tanner Jeannot.
Yeah.
And it looks like he's being Tanner Jeannot. The goal he scored, the first goal against Anaheim off of the Muvrare shot, where he, negotiated around Oscar Dansk and popped it in. Great. The Keel Thomas goal, great pass.
Oh, yeah.
Great pass by Jeannot. Great finish by Akil Thomas. None of it happens
without
Tanner Jeannot going into the corner and what's the phrase that they always use? Dispossessing his man. From
I like that one.
Yeah, it's great.
Every time I say it, I think of you.
Yeah, good. So that's, to me, we talked to Nelson Emerson about the Edmondsons, the Jeannots, the Burrows. Fogle doesn't really fit into the toughness revolution, but whatever. And we talked to Nelson Emerson about the idea of the trickle-down effect, right? Can you add guys like those, and their impact is larger than just what they do? And, listen, I know that I have waxed on and on and on in the past about the Arvidsson, Moore, Deneau line, but I think that line is more important. Whatever line Phil Deneau is on, and now Trevor Moore and Phil Deneau are on, I think is going to be more important than the points they put up.
I agree.
And Tanner Jeannot working on that line, I think, is more important than Fogle working with Byfield and Fiala, or LaFerriere working with Kopitar and Kempe. So I'm excited to see that line, at least in that one game against Anaheim, seemed to work.
Yeah. Even going to the Vegas game, because when Jeannot scored that one goal from distance, he just let that shot go. The play was over, right? Like the Kings had a 2-on-1 rush. Vegas defended pretty well off the rush. I forget who left it back. Maybe it was Fogle.
I think it was actually, it was Byfield and Fogle were on the line.
And Jeannot was jumping on the ice. Yeah. And the play was kind of over. Like, Fogle had to back off, but he kind of just left the puck there. And Jeannot came in and sniped it. And is that a typical Tanner Jeannot goal? No, it's not. And he said that afterwards. Like, most of my goals are going to come from around the net. But Zach Dooley pointed out to me, and we talked about it on the air that night in one of the intermissions, we've seen that before, though. You type in Tanner Jeannot highlights, and you see him score that goal in Nashville more than once. Like, that is a goal that he has scored. But he doesn't need to score that goal to be successful with the Kings and to help the Kings be successful, right? We know that he can do it, but that's not what he's supposed to be doing. He's supposed to score the goals like he did in Anaheim the other night. And this, for me, goes beyond Tanner Jeannot. It's also for, a guy like Warren Fogle. The goals that those guys have scored in the preseason are the goals that they're supposed to score. Those are the plays that they're supposed to set up, the shifts that they're supposed to have in the offensive zone. Like, I know that you look back at some of the guys who the Kings lost in the offseason, and like PL Dubois was a big name and had a lot of expectations, and he's gone now. Victor Arvidsson is a very terrific, skillful forward that I think had some high expectations on him. And when you lose guys like that have such a big kind of name and some big expectations attached to them, and bring in guys that maybe don't match up evenly with the name power and the expectations, you think that the team has maybe regressed a little bit. For me, what's pretty clear throughout the preseason and training camp so far is that those guys play very particular roles on this team, both in the room and on the ice. And what we've seen in the preseason is that it's worked so far, and I would like to think that it would work during the season. If they remain with the same line mates, if they change and play with different line mates, what I like about what we've seen from Foegele, and especially Jeannot, to your point, is they have been successful in the ways that I think the organization wants and needs them to be successful in the regular season. And so far in the preseason, we've seen them do exactly that. It's just whether or not it's going to continue into the actual season.
The phrase we've been using is proof of concept.
Yep.
Like,
I think it's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and you're right. So in the summer, Zach and I talked about the roster, the way we saw it, and not much has changed since then. And what I was saying was Laferriere with Kopitar and Kempe is a question mark. Byfield at center with Fiala is a question mark. Foegele coming in is a question mark. Moore and Deneau with a third partner who plays a totally different game than Victor Arvidsson, although the impact may wind up being essentially the same. Question mark. Fourth line, is Akil Thomas and Alex Turcotte going to be able to contribute at an NHL level? Question mark. What we've seen in the preseason, I want to stress this because it is just the preseason, right? That Ducks game, 2 or 3 really nice goals against a team full of guys that I was constantly looking at the roster going, I never heard of that guy.
Also, it's just a boring game.
Yes, and Oscar Dansk, not John Gibson, who has appendicitis.
Is going to be out for a while too.
But the
Lukáš Dostal show.
Yeah, so I don't want to go totally off the rails, being like, oh my god, those goals are the Akil Thomas goal, for example, the really nice play in the corner from Jeannot and the unbelievably nice pass from Phil Deneau. I'm not sure that play happens against a proper NHL team.
Probably not.
But having said that, the alternative is so much worse than the positive is good. Like, if the Kings had just lost every rookie game, lost every preseason game, nothing looked right, they looked listless and disinterested, if they all looked like they were trying to get traded to Washington, for example, that would have been horrible. And it would have been cause for tremendous concern. So the fact that none of that happened, the fact that the worst thing that happened was an uncontrollable, unforeseeable injury, right? It's nobody's fault. It's not, nobody did anything wrong. It just sometimes, and it's been happening all around the league. So you can't even.
Yeah, Laine's out now.
Yeah,
it happens.
It happened in Montreal. Doc, Panarin's hurt. It's injuries all over the place. And everyone says cancel the preseason. I just think every once in a while it happens.
Yep.
There's just a spate of injuries. It's coincidence. But the fact that the worst thing that happened in training camp, like I said, was out of your control, and that everything in your control, again, you can only beat the teams that are on the schedule. You can only play the guys in front of you. As you said, the fact that they're doing what they're expected to do, it gives me optimism, which I am uncomfortable with, but every year at about this time, I find myself talking myself into anyway. Because at the end of the day, I'm a fan and I do want the team to do well.
It's okay to be optimistic.
But what happens inevitably is in the summer when there's no games, there's no camps, I can't see anything. I'm just staring at the roster. The negative part of my mind creeps in and goes, well, you don't know if that's going to work. What if it doesn't work? I guess it's a weird form of anxiety. I don't know.
That's fair.
But then
that's sports fan anxiety.
But then once I see the guys on the ice, I'm like, oh, well, Laferriere scored that tapping goal on the power play, so that's going to work. Tanner Jeannot's doing what he's doing, that's going to work. Kemper got a shutout, so that's going to work. You know what I mean? Like, and before I know it, I've talked myself completely in whole hog.
It's funny because, the other night, the game in Ontario where Alex Laferriere scored twice, and one of them was that tap and goal on the power play. But he scored from around the net on the power play in back-to-back games now. 2 different goals, but almost the same kind of area he was right in front of the net both times.
Proof of concept,
right? So, that's something Zach Dooley and I talked about in the intermission report. We asked Jim Hiller after the game, hey, your proof of concept is there, right? Is that what you guys are trying to do? And he's like, yeah, That's what we're trying to do. He said he did point out, Duels, I'm pretty sure you could have scored that one power play goal, the tap in. You just had to poke it in.
Here's the crazy
But,
thing.
like,
That's
it's
a funny
there.
line, but it's not actually true.
No.
Like, no disrespect to Zach Dooley, but like, how many times have we seen guys miss wide open nets?
Yeah.
It's hard.
But like, sure, one of them was a tap-in.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, on the power play, the Kings seem like they want Alex Laferriere on the top unit in and around the blue paint. And they've done that in 2 games in a row, and he scored both times. So, there you go.
Yeah.
It's a preseason, but
Final question
optimism.
before we go. And I don't expect an answer, but feel free to try.
I'll give it my best shot.
It's 4 games. It's varying levels of competition, and it's a position that is voodoo. Any thoughts on the goaltending so far? I mean, Kemper played 1 game. He got a shutout. We've seen some Carter George. We've seen some Dave Riddick. We've seen some Eric Portillo. Like, any thoughts? The reason I ask is because in last year's preseason, I thought Riddick was spectacular in preseason, and I was sort of surprised he didn't begin the season on the roster. This season, I haven't seen anything, like Carter George obviously is off to Owen Sound. Eric Portillo will most likely begin the season in Ontario. Riddick and Kemper will most likely start the season in LA. So there's no, like, Darcy Kemper getting a shutout against that Anaheim Ducks roster. Not that he didn't have some excellent saves, but is not surprising.
He was more so tested early. And then for the second half of the first period and most of the second period, he didn't have to do anything. Like, and that's a credit not just to him, but to how the team played in general. But yeah, for me, coming into this season, I think that Darcy Kemper takes a big leap forward from last year in Washington. It's an injury-plagued season. It was really disappointing. I've got some friends in Washington who work for the organization or cover the organization, and I was very excited for Darcy Kemper to go to the Caps because I was really interested to see what he could do, and I was interested to see what happened, and he had a little bit of a down year, and then he got hurt, and good for them, they had Charlie Lindgren for the playoffs. It didn't go well, but for their playoff push, Charlie Lindgren was really good as well. I think that he takes a step forward. I think that he's been here before. I know that I've heard from a couple of people that he also credits Bill Ranford from the first time he was in LA with helping him out. And really for the Kings, that was a jumping off point for him. It really kind of seemed to help him, kickstart his career again. And since then he's gone on to win a Stanley Cup championship as the number 1 for Colorado a few years ago. So I expect him to take a step forward. What we saw from him in the preseason, shutout or not, was for me what we kind of expected to see from Darcy Kemper. David Riddick, more of the same. For me, the other guys are the younger ones. Carter George, I thought his first real kind of NHL experience in the preseason. He only played 2 periods. I think he gave up a goal in each one. One of them was in overtime, and it was a mistake that he and the defenseman had made that kind of cost him a goal. For me, that's not a goaltending issue. That was a freak kind of communication thing in overtime. It is what it is. From a goaltending standpoint, in the actual run of play, I thought he was fine. He looked good, and he was terrific in the rookie games. Eric Portillo, I don't know if they needed to see a ton from him. He was Ontario's number 1 last year after David Riddick left, and he set a rookie record for Ontario in net. He was also good. So, that's for me, that's kind of what we expected to see from the goaltenders, or at least what I expected to see is kind of what we got. No, I didn't think Darcy Kemper should go out and shut out the Anaheim Ducks on the road. But ultimately, given the performance that he gave, he got a really good result, and I think that that's, complimentary of the way that he played this in that game and in the preseason so far. So the goaltending, it's a tough question because the preseason is so weird. Very rarely early on are you seeing guys go a full 60 or 65 minutes. Only in the last 2 games did we see that, which is what Jim Hiller said was typically at this point you want to see the guys go for the full 60 minutes. But what we saw I thought was good, and I'm interested to see how they build on it once the regular season starts, or even in Quebec.
There are 2 X factors for me on the season. One is Alex Laferriere and how well he will complement Kopitar and Kempe, and the other one is goaltending. And that probably is an evergreen statement. Any team can be saved or doomed by good or bad goaltending. So that'll have an outsized influence on this team. Josh, thank you for joining me. Appreciate it. We're going to wrap it up. One final note before we go, Kings fans. There's 2 more preseason games left in Quebec. One is Thursday night. This episode will release Thursday morning. One is Saturday night. Both are being played in Quebec. I cannot share the details with you about how to watch them because they will break my kneecaps if I do. But trust me when I say that you will be able to watch them. So keep your eyes peeled and your ears open. More information on that coming soon, maybe even by the time you hear this episode. And apologies for not being able to share all the details. Josh Schaefer, thank you so much for joining me. Kings fans, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.